In today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint delicate, precise, fine lines in watercolor. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find all things watercolor, as well as drawing, mixed media, even a little bit of business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. It's free, and if you click that little bell icon, you'll get notified every time I have a new video for you. I make at least one free video a week here on YouTube on a Thursday with extra content for Patreon subscribers. Now, learning to paint in watercolours is very techniquey and it's all about options really. So what I try to do on this channel is give you lots of options. So I'm going to show you 7 different ways that you can create fine lines in watercolour. We're going to use tools, we're going to use brushes, we're going to use masking methods. And each of these will be more or less appropriate for different subjects and different applications. I'm going to explain more about that as we go through, so you know when to choose each of these techniques. You may not like them all, but you may just find the one that's absolutely perfect for you. So let's get started with the most obvious one, and that's to use a brush. Let me show you the best sort of brushes for painting fine lines. And do keep watching until the end of the video because I've got a bonus tip for you. I'm going to explain how the amount of water you add to your paint can actually affect how hard or how easy it is to paint fine detail and fine lines with your watercolours. So brushes, there are 2 basic types of brushes that you can use for painting fine detail. So we've got this one here. This is what they call a round brush, so it's just your standard paintbrush. It does have a point on the end, even though it's called a round brush, and this is just a very small size. They often call these detailers, but basically they're just a tiny size of round brush. They might be a 0, a 00, or a size 1. Brush sizes vary across brands, which is super annoying, but it'll certainly be very low on the number scale. The other type is a rigger brush. This is also a type of round brush, but you can see that it has a very elongated end, so it's long and thin. So when do you use these? Let's get some paint here. I've got a little bit of Perylene Violet here. We'll use the rigger first. Now, the thing with a rigger brush is because it's got this long body, it's good for making very long marks. So if you have something like grasses, and it was actually invented for ship's rigging, for painting ship's rigging, so if you have something like grasses or something where you just need that line to go on and on and on, then a rigger is a great brush. Now, to be clear, you can get this effect with any round brush, but if you do a lot of painting where you need long, thin lines, then you may find that a rigger is really helpful. So what about this tiny little brush? A little brush like this is fantastic for tiny details. So for instance, if you're doing something like an animal and you've got eyelashes, or perhaps you've just got the the little bit of the eye there and you just need to make that tiny little eyeball, you can do all of that with this tiny little detail brush. It doesn't hold a lot of paint, but then it doesn't need to. Next up, let's look at scalpel blades and embossing tools. These can give a fantastic result. So next up we have embossing and scoring tools. So I've got 2 things here. I've got an embossing point and I've got a scalpel blade. You'll see that I'm trying to get the camera to focus on. The embossing point has actually got a ball on the end. This is quite a large one. They come in much smaller sizes too. You can get sets of them. You can also use anything similar that you can find around the house, even a ballpoint pen with no ink left in it. Anything that makes a dent in your paper. If you're using the blade like this, you'll get a finer line, and you must be careful to hold it on its side while you score and not to press down and cut your paper. Now, these are great for giving fine lines, and what's going to happen is that when we paint on top of them in a moment, you're going to find that the paint actually sinks into the little dip that's made, and so you get a dark line appear. You can actually use embossing points like this for pencil work as well, where they can have the opposite effect and you can get a white line, but I've got stuff about that in other videos. These are great for leaf veins. They're also fantastic for painting things like fur and hair. So you probably can't see anything at the moment, but let's put some paint on top. Now, I've got some green oxide here. This is a really natural looking green, and I'm going to just take it across the top. It's actually a very pale green. I may indeed grab a darker one. You can see the lines starting to appear there. Let's try a darker colour. Actually, I'm not sure that was chrome oxide. I think that was a terra verde. Let's try this one instead. This is a mixed green colour. There we are, and you see those dark lines appearing. Now, what will make this stand out more is using granulating colours. You may need to apply it 2 or 3 times. How much it shows up depends on how many layers you put on. You don't want to go too pale with the paint, but then again you don't want to go too dark either. You can also do it while the paint's wet. This is also super effective. So let's go into the wet paint here. And again, I'm scoring these lines. And that paint pigment is being attracted to those dips. The effect here is quite subtle, but if we go a little darker, you may find that you get an even stronger effect. Let's try a little of the Perylene Violet again. As I said, you see, if you go too dark, you can't see it at all. So you want to just spread, layer your colours up. You often find with this effect that it appears quite strongly, and then once the paint's dry, it seems to disappear. Don't worry about that. Just go on with another layer of paint, and eventually you will build up and get the effects that you need. Now, you may have heard of using masking fluid to make fine details and fine lines. We're going to be looking at that later in this video. But have you heard of using wax resist? Next, we're going to use oil pastel and candle wax, and I'm going to show you how to apply it in a way that will give you a very fine line. Next up, we're doing a wax resist technique. So I've got some wax household candle, I've got an oil pastel, and I've also got some masking tape, and that's going to help to give us the straight line that we need. Now, this is really versatile. Candle wax is transparent, therefore I'm going to show you this technique on white paper, but you can actually put a layer of paint onto your paper, allow it to dry, and then use the candle wax, which is see-through, to reserve that underneath colour. The oil pastel is the opposite. It's opaque and it's coloured. So again, if you've made a mistake, you can go on top of paint and this will completely cover it. So I'm going to take some masking tape, and before I use it, I'm going to stick it to my clothing. I won't bother filming this, very tedious for you, but I'm going to pick up a lot of lint onto the sticky and reduce the sticky by about 50%. This will stop it from tearing my paper. Make sure you only do this on bone dry paper. Don't apply masking tape to damp paper. What I'm doing now is I'm pressing it onto my paper and I'm leaving a little thin line in between. It's actually tapering slightly, but let's do that. I think that will be interesting. I'll apply the candle wax actually to the bottom part of it. You want to go along the edge of the tape, not backwards and forwards like this, because if you do that, you risk pushing the wax under the tape. And at the top half of it, I'll go in with the oil pastel. And again, you sort of bring it backwards and forwards there so you don't have any gaps showing. And then we're going to remove the tape like this, holding it at a low angle and pulling it slowly so it doesn't tear our paper. So I've got some cobalt turquoise this time, and I've changed to an older brush. Particularly with the oil pastel, you may find that you pick up a little bit on your brush, so don't do this with your best brushes. And we're going to take this across, and you can see that both the candle wax, which remember it's transparent so you can use it over the top of other colours, and the oil pastel have resisted the paint. It's a fantastic technique. Remember that once you do this on your paper, it's permanent. You won't be able to paint over those areas again. So do just have a little try out on a scrap of paper first. But it's a fantastic option for getting a really straight line. It's amazing for things like picking out a white sail on a lake, whereby you can just take your paint right the way across and know that it's not going to cover that little white sail. At this point in the video, can I ask you, as always, if you're enjoying this video, if you're getting some value from these tips I'm giving you, can you please click that thumbs up button, that like button? It really makes a difference to the YouTube algorithm. If you can like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment, then YouTube will push this video out to more people. My channel will grow. I'm trying to get to 100,000 subscribers, and I'm so grateful to all of you who watch me on YouTube. So far we've looked at painting individual fine lines or making individual fine lines, but what about those times when you need multiple fine lines? I'm thinking of things like tree bark, fur, hair, even some types of foliage. Let's look next at using fan and rake brushes to make multiple fine lines. It's really easy, it's going to save you a ton of time and give you a really realistic result. Now there are a whole host of brushes that are sold for texture effects. They have names like tree brush, texture brush. They're often called rakes. This one here is a rake brush. I'm hoping you can see that it's been cut with little gaps in the end. Some of them are a lot more noticeable than this. This is quite a fine one. I've got this one here as well, which was a fan brush, and I just sort of chopped into it. This brush is for acrylics. It's often actually better when you're using these texture effects and dry brush effects to get an acrylic brush because they have stiffer bristles. This is just a really cheap acrylic fan brush, and I've chopped into it with a pair of scissors, but you can buy them ready-made like this. And brushes like this are great for getting texture and also fine lines. Now these brushes can be used for many things, but for the purpose of this video we're going to use a dry brush technique, so the paint's not too wet, and we're just going to stroke the bristles across like this. I hope you can see straight away how easy it would be to make fur and hair with a brush like this. Let's try the one that we've purchased. You can see that as soon as I start to put paint on it, those bristles start to show that they've been cut more thinly towards the end, and again you can get very fine effects with this. That's quite a dry brush effect. If I add a little more water, we can get more distinct marks too. Next up we have masking fluid. I find people fall into two camps. Either they've tried it and they absolutely hate it and they've messed up everything and torn their paper and sworn off masking fluid, I'm never going near it again. Or they absolutely love it and they chuck it on everything and use it in cases when it's really not very appropriate. So if you don't like masking fluid, or you think you don't like masking fluid, don't skip this part of the video. I'm going to show you how it can be incredibly useful and how you can avoid all those mistakes that you might have had with it in the past. Next up, I'm going to use masking fluid. So I've got some Schminky masking fluid here, and I'm just going to put a little bit out, decant a little bit like this. And I'm going to use a ruling pen to apply this with. You could use a toothpick. One of those rubber colour shaper tools would do the trick as well. And this is great for the centre of flowers, stamens, tiny little lines like that. Now, if you've used masking fluid before and you absolutely hate it and you've got in a mess with it, do have a look at my masking fluid playlist. There is more to say about masking fluid than I can possibly say in this video. The biggest mistakes come when people put too much of it on, and whilst some people hate it too much, other people love it too much and they stick it on everything. It can give a really harsh and unnatural look. I've almost never seen it applied well to leaf veins, for example. They always end up looking stubby and not very natural looking. It can also give you multiple problems like torn paper, and this can put people off. You know, either they don't notice that it just doesn't look very attractive or very realistic and they just keep applying way too much of it, or they completely put off it and they stop using it. Neither of these are good attitudes to have. Masking fluid is a really, really useful tool, especially for using in small, delicate areas. Now, it's great for doing window frames on houses in the distance. Let's make a little window frame here. I'll let this dry in a moment, and then I'll pop some paint on for you. Remember that every masking fluid is different and every paper is different. So in order to keep yourself out of trouble, you need to try your brand of masking fluid with your brand of paper first. There are also multiple mistakes that people make with masking fluid. As I said, I've got a whole video on masking fluid mistakes. Just put my name into YouTube and the word masking fluid and you will come up with some do's and don'ts that will keep you out of trouble and allow you to use this really useful tool without overusing it, without it looking harsh and unnatural, and without tearing your paper. I'm going to give that a couple of minutes to dry now. Depending on how warm it is where you are, will depend on how long it takes to dry. You can normally see a slight colour change. This is white masking fluid. This will go clear as it dries. So my masking fluid has dried now. Let's get a little bit of this colour here. And you can see, just like the candle wax, it's resisting the colour. But unlike the candle wax, we'll actually remove the masking fluid later on. Now, masking fluid can also be used to reserve an underneath colour, but it does tend to actually lift that colour up a little bit. So that's an advantage the candle wax has over the masking fluid, is that it will reserve the underneath layer of paint completely. Whereas if you put masking fluid on top of a dried layer of paint, be aware that it may lift some of that paint off and you may just need to retouch those areas. What I need to do now is let this paint dry. So don't be fooled by the cuts in the video. This has been left for some time and is now dry. I'm going to just use an eraser and remove that masking fluid. And you can see that we've got a good result here. As I said, masking fluid's not suitable for everything. It seems to work well for the stamens and the dots in the centre of flowers. I don't find it works well for leaf veins. It can be great for tiny details on houses, particularly in things like snow scenes. So don't discount masking fluid, but also don't use it for everything. If you've ever done any pen and wash, any line and wash work, you may have used an old-fashioned dip pen. Did you know you can use it for your watercolours too? It's not just useful for ink. Let's look at how to use a dip pen to create beautiful fine lines. You'll have so much more control than you have with a brush. So what I've got here is a very cheap dip pen. You get the holders for these and then you get nibs. This is a drawing nib. You want a drawing nib rather than a calligraphy nib, which are square cut on the end. And all we're going to do is dip in this paint here. You want to make sure there's not a bubble of paint on the back there, because that can lead to drips. Work quite close to where you're painting, which is why I'm holding this little pot close to where I'm working, so that I'm not taking this dip pen right the way across my paper and ending up with drips everywhere. And then you can use it just like ink. Now I've chosen phthalo blue for this, and that's not by accident. You want to use staining colours and strong colours for this because you get such a tiny fine line. It can be hard to see if you've got a very pale colour. And you can see I've mixed quite a lot of water in, so we do have an ink-like consistency. And look how fabulous these little lines are. They're great for botanicals. You could use them for tree bark, anything like that. It is somewhat time consuming to keep dipping in, so I probably wouldn't use them for something like hair, because you really would, you'd be making a rod for your own back. It would take you a very long time. You're much better to use one of those rake brushes that I showed you before. If you're wondering what these paints are, they're all made by Jackman's in the UK. There's a link in the video description, and I do actually have some sets of paints for you, some beginner's sets and floral sets, and even a shadow set that I have designed with Jackman's. If you're interested in those, they're in the video description. But you can use this method with any make of paints, and you've essentially just turned your watercolour into ink, and you can be a lot more precise than you can with a brush. Lastly, and this is one of my absolute favourites, because not only can you get a fine line, you can get a soft fine line. Sounds impossible, it's fantastic for botanicals. Next we're going to use watercolour pencils. Now, if you've watched any of my flower painting videos, any of my botanical videos, you'll have seen me use watercolour pencils. They are really so useful. They don't have to just be used alone. You can use them just alone. I have a full course all about making flower paintings with watercolour pencils, but you can also combine them with your watercolours and you can draw in. This will help the watercolour pencil to release extra pigment. You can get fine lines with them. If they're in need of a sharpen, you'll get fatter lines, and the lines will soften slightly, but they will remain as lines, and this can give you a really natural effect. As I said, fantastic for botanicals, for leaf veins, for adding detail around edges. If you're painting something like a leaf and you've got that bit where it's gone brown at the edge, I know I'm not using the right colour here, but you can see that you can easily get those little burnt bits, as it were, on the edge of leaves, as well as any little veins and marks on leaves, as well as petals, even tiny little dots. Watercolour pencils are here to make your life easier. So here's my bonus tip for you. Now, it's much easier to paint fine lines with paint that's a little bit thicker, and there are multiple science-based reasons for that. It's all to do with surface tension and with things like the binders and adhesives that go into the paint. The paint is going to spread and stay where you put it and splash less and run less and splatter less if it's thicker. So if you're using paint like this that's really very watery, you may find that it simply doesn't quite stay where you put it. You'll also find if you're using a bigger brush that you'll get lots of little splatters and things like that. Now, it's not wrong to use very watery paint like this. There may be times when you have to, but you're going to have to be aware that it can just be a little bit less precise and it's a bit less easy to get it to stay put. So if you're having to use paint like that, take your time with it. Don't put too much of it on the brush, because essentially you're painting with water. It's going to want to run, it's going to want to splatter, so move your brush slowly. When you are going in with thicker paint, you're just going to find that you are able to paint a little bit more precisely. The paint won't want to spill over. I'm on quite a smooth paper here, this is just a practice paper, but if you're on quite a textured paper, you're going to find that when you've got that very watery paint, it's going to just want to run and sort of move across those little dips and bumps in the paper. Whereas when you use a thicker paint, and it doesn't matter if you're using pans or tubes, the same thing applies, it's all about how much water you're putting in. When you use a thicker paint, You've got less surface tension, you've got less of the water wanting to run and splash, and you're going to get a more precise result. As I said, sometimes you do need to use watery paint. Just something to bear in mind if you do need to paint detail, that perhaps if you go in with paint that's a little bit thicker, you're going to have a better result. So do let me know in the comments which one of these tips you like the best. Perhaps you have some of your own to share with us as well. Now, before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in that video description, because I've got all sorts of good things in there for you. I've got some free downloadable PDFs. I've even got a free watercolor painting mini course that you can take. Now, none of the things that I've shown you today really work very well if you can't draw in any way. And if you're one of these people that says to yourself, oh, I can't draw, I can never draw, that's simply not true. You can start learning to draw today, and you can start gradually improving your skills. Not only do I have a full-length course that you can take if you want to, that's linked in the video description, but I also have this free video that you can watch right now that's going to show you the 10 most common drawing mistakes and how you can easily fix them. You can watch that video right now.